So when we look at intersectionality, your gender, sure, there's a women's program. But if I was Indigenous, neurodiverse, and gay, are there 4 separate programs to meet my needs? How do we know they're looking at the whole person? And then because it becomes overwhelming, there are actually 54 identities, individual ones, based on their lived experience. And so if you were then, I'm no mathematician, but if you did the maths on that, and I should ask someone someday to work it out, the infinite number of possible intersectionalities is not manageable. Across all of those identities, of all the research that I did, is that regardless of your identity and intersectionalities, you have 8 inclusion needs. Really simply, they are access, space, opportunity, representation, allowance, language, respect, and support. The reason these land so well is that it doesn't leave anyone out. We know the science around it. If we start talking about women, yes, it's men that need to adjust how they do things, but they switch off. Neuroscience switches off because they're not hearing their name, they're hearing someone else's name. And the same thing applies to all the other identities. This is my Inclusion Transformation Toolkit. I've been using the contents in this for 6 years. Basically, we start with room for improvement side and benefit, so prioritization side. So there are 3 pillars of inclusion transformation framework. So there's the strategy and change, there is the ways of working, and there is the employee life cycle. I get the CEO and direct reports, C-suite of every function and operation. You don't have to deliver this to them. You give them a bit of understanding of their inclusion needs and you kind of set up the scene for them. You go, right, you're going to read through these cards as a group and you're going to sort them under the headings of, we're nailing this as best practice. We've got some room for improvement, or I have no freaking clue. Like, we need to fix this. So the inclusive behavior one. So 3 categories. One is inclusive conscience, inclusive commitment, and one is inclusive collaboration. Inclusive conscience is kind of like in that EQ model, self-awareness about, I need to be inclusive. I know where I'm being inclusive. I know where I'm not being inclusive, and I'm taking accountability for developing my inclusive capability. The inclusive commitment is kind of more of the self-management and social awareness. But then the next layer is inclusive collaboration. And this is really where you're extending your capability, where you are consulting with others, you're holding others to account, you're developing inclusive teams, that kind of stuff. You're extending it into the way others work as well. I have the same sort cards that you can use to do the same kind of activity, all right, in workshops. Another way is that we use these to identify priority areas to then build their capability framework, and then to build that into job descriptions, job ads, and into their performance standards or expectations, and flow that through. Those other 2 are really at the strategic or systemic level. These change how people do work at the grassroots level. So inclusive meetings. So this is applying inclusive thinking in developing inclusive meetings in teams. So these work very differently to the others. They're not sort cards. These are basically applying inclusive practice in your meetings. There's discuss cards, there is explore cards, and there are act cards. So you kind of think discussing is kind of building the psychological safety in the team, start talking about how inclusive are we? Are there some opportunities? This one happens to have an activity on it, so it gives them something to look at and to start thinking about and prompt conversation. And then the ACT ones are really practical. Then inclusive action, this is brilliant. This could actually really take your practice. Like if you're really trying to facilitate with people more inclusive decision-making, this deck is magic, because you can do this in a workshop environment. You can develop their capability in any project, new decision, reviewing of a process or a procedure. It walks you through the learning of the 8 inclusion needs. So each of the inclusion needs has a level 1, which is teaching you about the need, a level 2, which is about assessing something else so you don't feel like you're really bad at something. You're going to think someone else is doing something really poorly. And then you take that learning into how you're going to do that differently.